How would you apply that model to the U.S.? Say we're past Caesar, we're past the point of being an effective republic. In practice, what do you think that would look like here?
I think we've actually ceased to be a functional republic in a long time. And this actually goes back to where we started. We talked about 1913 being a very pivotal year.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at it, I think to me, that was around the time period we ceased to be a functional republic. Because if you look at it, the executive branch has started to kind of overrule the others, right? Where there's not really three co-equal branches of government anymore. And at the same time, the actual will of the people doesn't seem to matter all that much, right? Like
I think most people would agree with you on that.
Just kind of does that. So to me, I think we've been more of an empire for a really long time. And I think you have to decide, do I want to save the empire or do I want to try and bring it back a republic, which I think at this point in time, we're so far beyond that. That was the part of the conversation on Cleared Hot I most wanted to land carefully, and we covered so much ground in 2 hours that I never fully developed it. Because the answer I gave Andy was a conclusion, not an argument. Saying America has ceased to be a functional republic is a thesis. The argument is the mechanism. How a country that still holds elections, still maintains a constitution, still calls its leaders by Republican titles, can have quietly transformed into something else underneath the language that describes it. The mechanism is identifiable. It runs through one specific year, 3 specific laws, and 4 stages of compounding institutional drift. By the time the 4th stage completes, the country isn't what the name says it is anymore, even though every visible form of the original system is still in place. This is the pattern that I want to finish here. How America actually stopped being a republic. Why it never looks like collapse from the inside, and why this question, the one Andy asked at the end, is the one that matters more than almost any political question being argued right now. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This is Hidden Forces in History. I'm the CEO of Command Your Brand. You can find us at commandyourbrand.com. If you came here from Cleared Hot, welcome. Andy and I covered a lot of ground. Augustus, the 5 good emperors, the Punic Wars, the 3rd century crisis, Constantine's gold solidus, the 1913 Federal Reserve, the immigration question, and the fall of America might actually look like. The companion to this video on the Roman Pattern channel focuses on the Roman side of that conversation, how Rome lost its army across 4 stages over 5 centuries. The link is below. This video focuses on the American side, how the architecture of an empire got installed inside a republic, in 1 calendar year, more than a century ago. Before I get into the framework, 3 corrections I owe you on the record. First, on the Roman silver coin. I said Augustus's denarius was 95% pure silver, and Aurelian's was 5% silver by 274. The 95% figure for Augustus is right. The Aurelian figure is actually generous to Aurelian. By his reign, the silver content of the standard coin was closer to 3 to 4%, and his predecessor, Gallienus, had already debased it below 5%. The 250-year arc I described is accurate. The endpoint was actually worse than what I told you. Second, on the Federal Reserve Act timing. I said it passed essentially when no one was looking, over the Christmas holiday. The vote was on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, and many members of Congress had left town for the holiday. That part's true, but the bill itself had been extensively debated in conference committee for months, and the major framework had been settled at Jekyll Island in November 1910, 3 years earlier. So the bill wasn't a surprise. The timing of the final vote was deliberately scheduled when public attention was elsewhere, which is a different and more deliberate thing than what I described. Third, on Caracalla's citizenship grant. I said he gave 30 million people citizenship overnight. The actual number is debated. Modern scholarly estimates put the new citizens created by the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212 AD at somewhere between 20 and 30 million, with a total Roman citizen population after probably around 40 million. The point I was making is that citizenship was massively diluted in a single legal stroke, and that holds. The exact number is contested. I owe you precision on the record. With those corrected, Here's the framework. Republics don't die by coup. They die by amendment. When a republic transforms into something else, it doesn't announce the transformation. The institutions stay in place. The names of the offices stay where they are. The procedures stay the same. What changes is what happens inside those forms. The function moves underneath while this form stays visible. America ran through 4 stages of this transformation across roughly 120 years. By the time the 4th stage completes, the country isn't operating as a republic anymore. It's operating as an empire. Not in the territorial sense. America had territorial expansion since the founding. In the institutional sense. A system where central authority can act without meaningful internal constraint. The 4 stages are sequential. Each one prepares the conditions for the next. None of them look like regime change while they're happening. All of them are visible to anyone who knows where to look. Stage 1. The original republic where structural checks are built into the design. Stage 2. The 1913 architecture that removed those checks in 1 calendar year. Stage 3. The professionalization of the political class that filled the vacuum afterward. Stage 4. The empire without the name that operates today. So let me walk through each one with the American evidence. The American Republic was designed with limits built into the structure. The federal government couldn't raise unlimited revenue because revenue came from tariffs and excises, and both have natural ceilings tied to actual economic activity. You can only tax imports so much before trade stops. You can only tax specific goods so much before people switch to alternatives. The federal government couldn't create unlimited currency because the currency was tied to gold and silver. The Treasury could only issue what the metal in its vaults backed. The federal government couldn't override the states unilaterally because senators were selected by state legislatures rather than by direct popular vote. The state held the institutional voice. A senator who acted against the interests of the legislature that sent him there got recalled by the legislature. Constitutional amendments still required 3/4 of the states to ratify. Those weren't bugs in the system. They were the design. The founders had studied Rome. They'd studied Greece. They had read Polybius on the cycle of regimes and Aristotle on the classification of governments. They knew that democracies historically degenerate into tyrannies because unlimited central power eventually accumulates with someone who claims to restore order. They built the fences, specific structural fences designed to interrupt that cycle. The fences worked for about 124 years, from 1789 to 1913. That's stage 1. The original architecture with structural constraints designed specifically to prevent the transformation that eventually happened anyway. In 1913, 3 laws passed. The 16th Amendment, ratified on February 3rd, created the federal income tax. Before that, the Constitution didn't permit direct federal taxation of personal income. Federal revenue was capped by what tariffs and excises could produce. The income tax removed that cap. Now Congress could take any percentage of any income at any rate, scaling directly with the economy. The 17th Amendment, ratified on April 8th, changed how senators are selected. State legislatures lost the power to choose senators. Direct popular election replaced it. The bicameral design, House for the popular vote, Senate for the states, became unicameral in effect. Both chambers now answer to the same constituency. The Federal Reserve Act, signed on December 23rd, created a central bank with the authority to issue currency, set interest rates, and buy federal government debt. The last authority is the critical one. When a central bank buys government debt with money it created out of nothing, the government can spend without raising taxes openly. The inflation that follows is a hidden tax on everyone holding the old currency. 3 laws, 1 calendar year. Each one looked like a reform when it passed. Each one addressed a real problem of the time. Together, they removed every structural constraint the founders had built into the system. The revenue ceiling, gone. The structural check between state and federal power, gone. The currency discipline, gone. The form stayed in place. Elections still happened. The Senate still met. The Constitution was still framed on the wall. But the function had moved. This is the year the foundation changed. Not the founding, the first reset. Now the first clip. 1913 is an extremely pivotal year because you get three things that year. You get your income taxes, the Federal Reserve Act, and then also the 17th Amendment passes. And that's where states can no longer, the state legislatures no longer vote for senators. And they were trying to solve a corruption problem, which I understand. Somebody's brother is a governor and they're trying to give him the job. But the problem is the House and the Senate now serve the same purpose. They're both popularly elected, whereas the Senate was supposed to basically show what the states wanted, and the House was supposed to show what the people wanted.
Yeah.
And now we don't have that at all. So it's like if you look at our system since the progressive era, that's really where we've gotten the type of government we have now. And, FDR builds everything up even more. But the big changes are really the turn of the century.
1913 is when income tax started?
Started 1913. That's stage 2 complete. The architecture is installed. Most Americans alive at the time, they didn't notice. The visible institutions all looked the same. The deep structure had already moved underneath them. Once the structural constraints are gone, the political class consolidates. The founders didn't design the political class to be permanent. Washington served 2 terms and went home to farm. Jefferson did the same. Adams went back to Massachusetts and resumed his law practice. The expectation was return to civilian life. Public service was a temporary obligation, something like jury duty with higher stakes. The model worked because it required legislators to have life outside of government to return to. They felt the consequences of their own laws. A senator who passed a bad tax policy went home and paid those taxes himself. A representative who voted for war went home to a town that had sent its sons to fight in it. The accountability was structural. It came from legislators' continuous exposure to the world he had just legislated. The model started breaking in the early 20th century. The federal government got larger because the 1913 architecture allowed it to get larger. Service in Washington became more profitable. Salaries went up. Pensions appeared. Personal staffs multiplied. By the second half of the century, a different career path had emerged entirely. Law school, then political staff work, then a state office, then a federal seat, the committee chairs, then leadership, then a corporate board or a think tank. The entire career runs inside the government and government-adjacent institutions. Most of the long-tenured names in Washington today have never held a non-political job for any meaningful length of time. They've never run a business, never made a payroll, never been laid off, never paid for health care out of the pocket the way most of their constituents do. This isn't a personal failing of any individual. It's a structural GIF. When the public service becomes a career, the people in it stop being temporary servants and become a political class. A permanent class with its own internal interests, its own preservation instincts, its own incentives separate from the constituents it's nominally there to represent. And once that class exists, it shapes legislation to protect itself. Term limits don't pass. Insider trading restrictions don't pass. Pension reform doesn't pass. Not because no one wants them, because the people who would pass them are the same people they would constrain. That's stage 3. The professional class that emerged in the space the 1913 architecture opened up. The same loyalty transfer mechanism Andy and I talked about on the Roman side, where Roman soldiers stopped being loyal to the state and became loyal to their commanders, running inside the political class instead of the military. Now the second clip. There was a couple things that Washington really wanted. Number one is he wanted congressional representation to be for smaller groups of people, so you'd have a lot more congressmen, which is good because they wouldn't agree on much. And the other thing that he wanted was basically to do a couple years of service, and then you go back to whatever your career was. But for a lot of these guys, it's what they do for the rest of their life.
Yeah, and the net worths associated with the salaries, which are publicly disclosed, the math gets a little bit askew on that as well. I think there needs to be some change. Again, I'm not an expert in government, but I think there needs to be some changes in our government. I mean, I was reading in the newspaper this morning. It's going to get really interesting, in my opinion.
Stage 3 complete. The political class is consolidated. The institutional checks are gone. What's left is the visible form of a republic operated by people whose career incentives are entirely internal to the system. Put the pieces together. Unlimited revenue from the income tax. Unlimited money creation through the Federal Reserve. The structural check between state and federal power removed. a professional political class with no return to civilian life pressure, a currency that has lost 97% of its purchasing power since 1913, a permanent administrative apparatus operating most of the daily governance. That isn't a republic. It's the architecture of an empire. An empire is a system where the central authority can act without meaningful internal constraint. It accumulates resources from the periphery to the center. It maintains itself through professional administration rather than active citizen participation. It uses currency to mandate power across distance. It manages a population larger than any individual citizen has ever practical relationship with. Rome built exactly that same kind of architecture under Augustus. He kept the Senate. He kept the consuls. He kept the religious offices and the assemblies and the magistrates. Every form of the republic remained visible, but the function had moved. Power sat with one office, controlled by one person, executing through a professional administration that survived any individual emperor. Augustus called himself princeps, first citizen, never king, never emperor, because the word would have broken the cover story. Americans use different language: public servant, senator, congressman, president. The titles sound like a republic. The function has moved underneath them. Representative now serves a federal apparatus that delivers most of what voters actually experience as government. A senator now responds to popular vote pressures, party leadership, and donor networks, in roughly that order. A president now commands an executive branch that has expanded into nearly every domain of modern life. A Federal Reserve chair sets the price of money for essentially the entire global financial system. None of those positions existed at the founding the way they exist now. Some didn't exist at all. They emerged from the 1913 architecture and the institutional expansion that followed it. The American empire doesn't have an emperor. It doesn't need one. It runs on the architecture. The architecture is the empire. And the architecture has been operating since the year the foundation changed. Now the third clip. Quantitative easing is a really simple way for saying printing more money. It's a complicated way to say a simple thing.
So there's no accident in that term existing.
No.
Because the normal
They're
person
easing the quantity of it.
Yeah, but also normal people would ask a follow-on question if you just said, we're printing more money.
Yeah.
If you say quantitative easing, what you do is you put up this little intellectual barrier.
Correct.
That most people aren't going to want to cross, to include
Correct.
myself. I'd be looking at that and be like, I don't want to be a part of whatever conversation is happening because I need to go to the bathroom and Google what that term means.
Yeah. But I think that's often the things that politicians do is they try to use terms that other people don't understand. They probably don't understand themselves, frankly,
Yeah.
but they use them to get one over on you. And
how did Rome, in essence, in the modern era, when you say print more money,
yeah,
that's literally what we're doing is printing probably.
Well, we're not actually printing anything. We're just making more ones and zeros in a computer. This is the pattern. 4 stages. Each one looks like an adaptation while it's happening. Each one preserves the visible form, the elections, the chambers, the titles, the constitution on the wall, while the underlying function transfers somewhere else. Stage 1, the original republic with structural constraints. The constraints work because they're built into the design. Stage 2, the 1913 architecture removes the constraints in a single calendar year. 3 laws presented as reforms that together rewrote the operating system. Stage 3, the professional class fills the vacuum. Career incentives consolidate inside the system. Accountability to the world outside the government weakens. Then it disappears. Stage 4, the empire without name. The visible republic operated by a permanent class through institutions that have no meaningful internal check. Each stage is downstream of the previous one. Each stage is also downstream of the 3 patterns I usually talk about on this channel: money, identity, and power. Currency debasement is the engine of stage 2. Identity dilution is the consequence of stage 3 and 4. Power centralization is the structural result of all of it. And once the country is at stage 4, the question isn't whether the system is still a republic. The question is what form the next regime takes. Andy asked me what it would look like in practice if America ceased to be a functional republic. The honest answer is that it looks like what's around us right now. A federal government that spends about $7 trillion a year, of which roughly half is borrowed. a national debt that has added $35 trillion in the last 30 years, financed largely by a central bank that's purchasing treasury obligations. A Senate that no longer represents states institutionally. It represents the popular vote majority of each state, which means it effectively represents the cities of each state. A House of Representatives whose seats are apportioned by total population, which means representation tracks demographic flows, and those don't always correspond to citizenship. A federal civil service of roughly 2 million career employees who outlast every administration and who write most of the rules that govern daily American life. Political class whose net worth grows during their time in office at rates that have nothing to do with their official salaries. A currency that has lost 97% of its 1913 value, with no remaining structural constraint on further debasement. None of that is hidden. All of it is on the record. The question is whether it adds up to republic in any meaningful sense, or whether it adds up to something else operating under the Republican branding. The historical record from Rome suggests one specific thing. Once the architecture is installed at this stage 4, the system runs its own logic until something external forces a reset. Rome's reset came from outside: barbarian armies, currency collapse, infrastructure failing. Constantine briefly stabilized it by reinstituting the gold solidus, which ran for 700 years without any serious inflation. The architecture is reversible if there's political will to reverse it. The political will requires a political class to legislate against its own interests, which is the same problem Augustus's senators had. They could have stopped the transition. They benefited from not stopping it, so they didn't. That's the structural problem. Not whether we know how to fix it. We do. The 17th Amendment could be repealed. The currency could be tied to something physical. The administrative state could be constrained to actual constitutional authority. Each is mechanically possible. Each requires the people who benefit from the current architecture to vote against their own benefit. Historical precedent for that is rare. This is how a republic actually stops being a republic. Not in one election, not in one war, not in a moment of dramatic collapse. Through 4 stages of compounding architectural change that preserve the visible institution while replacing what it actually serves. America has run all 4 stages. The architecture is operating. The pattern is documented. The question is no longer whether the transition has happened. The question is what comes after. Plato wrote about this in Book 8 of the Republic. He described a cycle. Democracies degenerate into tyrannies. He said because unlimited freedom eventually produces enough disorder that the population accepts whoever offers to restore order. The strong man appears, not as a usurper, but as a defender. The population hands him power. The cycle completes. The American framers try to interrupt that cycle. They built the fences. The 1913 architecture removed several of those fences. The cycle is now running again. Same playbook, different century. Same result, unless something changes. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This is Hidden Forces in History. I'll see you Wednesday.